Very good.
And wait, are we off? We are off.
All right. We have a lot to do this morning, and let's start. Would you like to start with some simple counterpoint?
Yes,
Yeah,
Sure.
start to all of that. Okay, all right. Let's see if I can. Okay, that's a very. I didn't think you were going to be here.
No.
That's it. Well, no, but okay. Well, this is a simple two-part second species counterpoint. Something that I think you're all acquainted with. By the way, a very interesting thing happened to me on the way to Curtis. A friend of mine suggested that I watch a couple of videos on the YouTube from our sister conservatory. And it happened to be a video of some instructor talking about counterpoint. And it actually was trying to explain properties of the Cantus firmus. And I shall now imitate the lesson on the Cantus firmus, these are the impressions that I got, right? So, the Cantus firmus is like driving to work, right? You back out of the driveway and then you make a right and you continue one block, right? And then you make a right turn, and then you have to make an immediate left turn. And you go for a little bit, in the same direction, and, after the fourth they tell us, you should change directions. So we make a right turn, and then we continue along a little ways, and then we make a left turn. And then, with the office building in sight, we continue along till we get. And that's how you make a Cantus firmus.
Sounds accurate.
Now, what if you were a student at the Curtis Institute in a counterpoint class, and someone explained properties of the Cantus firmus to you like that? What would you think? What?
Cooper's method 5.
Once again,
You're a student.
what did you say?
No, never mind. That's funny.
Now, I find that hard to believe because it is at a prestigious school like Curtis. Not Curtis. Don't get me wrong. I did not do that. Right? But what would you think about that?
Depends on the level of the counterpoint, of course. If it were for a
We're
beginner,
at the conservatory level.
no. I mean, if it were like an introductory counterpoint for people who haven't seen it before, I'd say it was a travesty. But I think if it's for people who already know how to write a Cantus firmus, it's kind of cute.
So it's kind of cute.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like what's it called?
Yes, but the class is presumably supposed to be an introduction to counterpoint.
Oh.
I think that's, I don't know. What would your attitude be about something like that? And then I'm going to dispense with this. That's irritating fact number one today. So what would you think about that? Suppose I were that you had just entered the Curtis Institute and I was responsible, which I'm no longer responsible, for teaching introductory counterpoint. And I came in and said that to you.
Well, it
What
doesn't
would you
teach-
feel like?
It doesn't teach the rules of counterpoint.
No, it has nothing to do with counterpoint, number one, right? Because I don't see any comparison, or the analogy is faulty, yes, I think. I think it has to do anything. It might have to do with the direction in which you steer the car, right? But what kind of infantile comparison is that? So how do you feel? And people would challenge my argument here that say I'm putting words into your mouth and making you feel a certain way, but I don't intend to do that. How would you respond to that? Besides laughing. Would it make any difference to you? How would you feel?
Untaught.
What?
Not taught. If someone said that to me, I wouldn't have learned anything.
Right. But what would you also feel, probably?
Frustrated.
Well, that's another one.
Patronized.
Yes, we're getting closer to the truth, I think. Patronized, and I would feel insulted. You know, I had some pretty bad instructors along the way. And, you know, I made it my life's work not to be like that, right? But now, why do you suppose that instructor did something like that? What's the word that, you know, you would use for a teacher that's trying to that presents counterpoint in that manner? Begins with an E. And it's usually what you announce when you're going to get married.
Ugh.
No, don't say that. Engagement. Okay. All right. Well, did you go to the Super Bowl? You didn't go to Minnesota? Well, did you watch the Super Bowl? Well, I bet you didn't watch the one I watched, which is the Super Bowl of science, right? It'd have to be alive for about 600 years. See how engaging this is, right? All right. Well, the Super Bowl of science started like basically in the 16th century. Yeah? Around that time, right, in 1500s or so. And who got to the Super Bowl in the 16th century? Of science.
Newton?
Mm,
Was he born? Oh no, he was later.
a little bit later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Galileo and Copernicus.
No, okay. Well, who was before that? My good friend Renee.
Oh.
Yeah? Okay. So the Super Bowl of science is the battle between rationalism and empiricism. What's the difference between those two paradigms? They're both methods of inquiry, ways of looking into things, or one of them is the way of looking at things, and the other one is the way of looking into things.
Rationalism, I guess you could say, is more deductive, and empiricism is more inductive.
Well, that's one way of phrasing it, and if you are a student of Peirce, he might agree with that at a certain level. Peirce? Who is Peirce?
Probably another one of those philosopher dudes.
Well, yes, but he was a rationalist in a certain sense. All right. Well, what is rationalism?
Anything that you can deduce is the only thing that you can assume.
Well, how do you deduce something?
Well, with a logical argument.
Well, where does the logical argument come from? Does it come from things, observations that you make on the surface, or the phenomenon that you're looking at You're
that-
saying, well, because it's doing this, it must be that.
Well, no, wouldn't
That's
that
a
be
logical
empiricism?
propositional statement.
Something that gives you never mind.
The first step has to be what?
Premise.
Well, where does the premise come from?
Observation.
If you look at something and you're trying to figure out what in the world is this doing, you have to be what? You can't say, see the sun. It rises in the morning and it sets at night. That's what the sun is doing, right? That's an empiricist remark. What would the irrationalist approach be? Let's say the approach that someone like Galileo would take, who was definitely a rationalist and really the founder of modern scientific inquiry. So, what did Galileo say?
What is the sun?
What?
What is the sun? I'm just taking mad stabs here.
Well, yes, he would have to ask that question, maybe. But he is what about the phenomenon? First of all, apparently he realizes that it's beyond appearances. Yes? And so the minute you say that, it means that you are what by the phenomenon? You are
Skeptical?
what?
Skeptical about?
And that means you're questioning, yes? So you're puzzled about the phenomenon. The first thing you have to be in a rational inquiry is you have to be puzzled by the phenomenon because you cannot understand it by simple observation. So you have to begin to explore various possibilities. This is what Peirce calls the scientific intuitive, scientific intuition. But intuition will not carry you through to a rational conclusion. The other feature about rationalism is that it is what? Since it's not dealing with what is on the surface, it says that you can't trust what's happening on the surface. So the inquiry into it eventually becomes some kind of what? Conjecture, right? But the conjecture itself is what? Is it literal or is it an abstract model? It's abstract. It tries to filter out things that are irrelevant or don't make any sense, and then trying to focus on something, some principle that will hold if you ever get around to testing it. That is the scientific process. That is the rational process. What is the empiricist process?
Is to take all like things that we can experience through our senses as being like accurate as to how things truly are.
Yes, as a guide to interpretation.
Yeah.
That's
And
what it means.
Does empiricism like typically not go into the kind of conjecture or deeper thought about things like you were saying?
Well, empiricists make rational statements. Make logical statements.
Okay.
But they are founded basically in, observations. What you can see, what you see is what you get. That is anti-scientific.
We're limited in a lot of scientific fields by only empiricism, like psychology for one.
Well, is psychology a science?
I assume so.
No. I don't think it's a science. However, with the advent of various encephalographic means of figuring out what some properties of the brain, it has taken a scientific turn. But essentially,
It's statistics more than anything.
yes, it turns into that. And that is not necessarily scientific. You see, once you begin to talk about these things, it does open up venues that you have to explore. The word statistics. Now, Is music statistical?
Sometimes.
What is statistical, at any rate? What does that
We
mean?
could survey the number of white keys versus black keys in a given piece. That would be statistical.
That's one approach.
I don't know if it
Right?
would be relevant.
Will that lead you to a theory of how music is done, what music is? Or would it lead you to some observations that, given a particular circumstance, this prediction might be valid? It's like aiming a camera. This is one of Chomsky's big arguments. And he says you put a camera outside the window and you watch the blowing leaves and the pattern of the wind and all that, and you can predict maybe what is going to happen given various circumstances. Well, that kind of prediction, it's like the prediction of the weather, can be fairly reliable. It's not foolproof, but it could yield some kind of results. But that in no way tells you what are the principles behind such things. Yes?
Isn't the theory of harmony essentially just statistics?
Yes, it is.
Saying that a certain chord follows a certain chord most of the time, except when we can't explain it?
Yes, it is. Yes, that is a purely empiricist and statistical way of looking at things. And out of statistics, you can evaluate the system and propose some kind of formal property. But in no way does that necessarily mean that the formal properties that you have conceived is any way close or related to the phenomenon itself. Understanding an explanation of the phenomenon itself. That's a far deeper and a far more complicated process. Are you following me? I would just like for you to think about that for a while. At any rate, nobody's denying that there are certain patterns that come up, right? But it is fairly clear that the brain is not essentially a pattern recognizer. It is, in one sense, the phonotactic system, both in languages and in discrete pitch perception, which is music. Yes, an infant understands or begins to organize the language on the basis of patterns in the speech, which are perceived as prosodic or rhythmic relationships. Then it goes from there to understanding how the symbols are put together that form the syntax and the hierarchy of symbols that are put together that generate a specific grammar and syntax of a language. Those cues are given away in the phonotactic system. But the phonotactic system is a module. It's a module of the brain. It's the representation of whatever computation or generation that has gone on in the brain abstractly that interfaces with that system and is allowed the sensory motor system, or allows the sensory motor system to explicate it or to get it out. So it is in those systems that properties of linear sequencing occur, not in the generation of the content itself. That has been demonstrated times, many, many times, yet it is still, in some quarters, resistant. Now, I want to look very briefly at the simple second species counterpoint, and I want us to try to delve more deeply into the relationships that exist between these tones. Now, you've heard me discuss the nature of the cantus firmus. One of the questions that I asked initially when I started working on all of this, is the cantus firmus simply a series of notes that have just purely surface contextual relationships? That's a statement that appears in the book that my own teacher wrote, right? And that particular book is an incredible book, and it's a major step forward into understanding the principles and parameters associated with contrapuntal organization. But it's inadequate, because what does the word contextual mean? it means that each one of these tones are only relating to one another as they move along. That there is no larger context in which the tones relate on a larger scale to one another. So I think that idea of purely contextual relationships is false. And I think that it can be demonstrated that it is false. Well, I begin to ask, what is it that is in this that allows you, in this particular case, to hear this note, the do or the C or whatever you want to call it, as a fundamental? Because it is surely this tone that is somehow being projected across this. It starts and it ends on that tone. And it does progress in some manner, although you've got, to basically the middle of the cantus firmus, you reach the kind of boundary interval that the harmonic series tells us is a key indicator of what this fundamental pitch is. As a matter of fact, along the way, halfway between the beginning note and this note, essentially, you have the fifth harmonic. Well, it turns out from empirical studies, scientific experiments, that your peripheral auditory system decides the relationship that uses the relationship of these two harmonics to determine what that fundamental is. And as a matter of fact, the fundamental does not have to be really present. It can be very weak, but it really doesn't have to be present. Just on the basis of one or two harmonics or three harmonics, it can project or assess that the relationships produce that fundamental. All right? So the first thing we have is the fact that perhaps that and that constitutes an impression of a fundamental. Well, these are contextually related, but they are related to the notion of that as a fundamental, and this is a boundary, and this is in the middle. The harmonic series doesn't display these things like that. What has to happen in order for this to follow this and this to follow that? If you know anything about the harmonic series. All right, either one of these harmonics in the same octave register as the fundamental? No. No. As a matter of fact, no. All right? How many octave registers is this particular tone above this fundamental? 3 octave registers. This would be small do, do 1, do 2, lies above do 2, right? There are 3 octave registers. Are you following this? Okay. So the octave equivalence things is also an important factor. All right. So we also see that this interval, right, by most people's standards, is considered an unstable interval. I mean, even in the cognitive surveys of musical phenomena today, that's not recognized as some kind of unstable interval that seeks to move ahead or down or up or whatever, right? So that's an unstable idea. And this tone in relationship to that is also unstable. But you see from here to here, this kind of tension, if you're going to use that word, releases itself. It's related to that. So these two notes are contextually related to this and this, yeah? All right. Well, a lot of discussion has ensued about the fundamental properties of consonance and dissonance. And if you explain consonance and dissonance, in my opinion, in a purely empiricist way, or in a purely sound way, you miss the point, because we're trying to devise some abstract relationship between consonance and dissonance that has some kind of significance in the generation of musical content. So here enters the concept of relational properties between tones. The dissonance acts as a relationship, part of a propositional statement that says, if this moves to this, then this must move to that. So it puts these two tones in some kind of conditioning environment or an argument structure with this tone. Now, if we're looking at it that way, then this tone has to come from that, move to this, but it must move here, right? But interpreted between this and its goal here is this. Well, what is that doing there? Following the idea that we've developed that this is some kind of conditioning environment, and that is the relation that puts these two things in a kind of argument context. Why don't we apply the same principle here? This is the tail end of some kind of conditioning environment. If that is so, then obviously that's going to be the source of the conditioning environment. So we see that as the consonance, this as the dissonant element. Are you following it so far? All right. Then these two tones, just look at them. If we're saying that this is a consonant conditioning environment, what has been created between these two tones? The same interval, yes? So it appears that if you have this dissonance, we'll call that dissonance or relational tone, and you have this one coming from another source, you have two things. This represents a polyphonic interval, a two-voice level. And it also says, apparently, that these two dissonances, when they are following one another, they must produce some kind of consonance. Why is that? Why would that be a logical assumption? Or is it? This is a fact of, this is all in the cantus firmus, and it's not driving to work. This is all in the cantus firmus. I'm trying to show you some aspects of the thought process that leads to the development of an abstract principle that can then be tested in musicalistic structures or in literal structures, things that you see or things that happen. So the next step is to formulate some kind of principle of the relationship of consonance and dissonance. We already have one part, and that is the relational idea between the conditioning environment. Yes? Which says, abstractly represented, the passing tone is the argument between elements X and Y, or the conditioning environment. And as we have said before, that this also supposes some kind of symmetry. The relationship is symmetrical under certain circumstances. I mean, I've left out part of the, the logical statement that says that. But it turns out that that is a symmetrical relationship. But that doesn't answer the question that why must, when two dissonances follow one another, why do they produce a third? Why must they produce a consonance? Do we know enough information yet? Think about that. Okay, now let's look at this. If this line is organized in this way, and that is a dissonance, that is a dissonance, these two dissonances following one another appear as a consonant interval, and those are all presumably related to this note. What explains that note? what is the relationship of this note to that note? And of this note to that note?
6 and a 4.
Forms the 6.
That to that, right? Is that a consonance or a dissonance?
Consonants.
It would be a consonance. It's one step above a boundary consonance, right? Okay. The sixth here, if we turn it upside down, is a third. The third is, a kind of consonant axis. Well, if you look at this, and we have said that this note is coming from this boundary interval that's present somehow, then this creates the interval sequence of 5, 6 to 5. Now see, none of this is possible unless you understand that there is a deeper contextual meaning in the relationships. It's actually polyphonic. It's not just linear sequencing. I think we can say that, yeah? Because we have ascertained that the relationships, the generation of that note and that note, come from two different places. So it's not just linear motion. Tone 1, tone 2, tone 3, tone 4. That's out. That must be wrong. Seems wrong. And here's more support for that. The boundary interval, is finally voiced or heard. That immediately returns to this note, which further enforces the consonant relationships of these. But then, all of a sudden, you have this note again. So this time it's a little clearer where it might come from. If we said that this note is coming from that boundary interval, then this must be the connection, right? Okay, what about this note? Well, this note is actually sustained, yeah, from here. Then finally, we have this descent from above. This is a passing tone. So, the logic in this sequence is consonance, dissonance, consonance, dissonance, consonance, dissonance, consonance. Right? Any questions about this so far? Mm-hmm.
This doesn't necessarily represent my belief, but what stops us from talking about some of these notes in the cantus as, for instance, delays of melodic progression or an appoggiatura and other things like that?
Appoggiatura. What is the definition of an appoggiatura?
The accented beat is a dissonance and then it resolves to a consonant on the unaccented beat. And the consonant that it resolves to is the note that you're actually going to, but the accented dissonance is sort of held over instead.
Well, where does the accent in the dissonance come from?
Meter.
Is there meter in this?
There are whole notes. You can ascribe meter to it too. As you go between consonants and dissonance, don't you feel more strong points on the consonants?
What is meter?
Rhythm.
No, I make a distinction between rhythm and meter. And for instance, in the statement, I went to the store to purchase some apples. What's the rhythm in that?
There was like
Eighth notes.
emphasis on store and apples,
And what?
maybe
When.
when to
Yes.
but it wasn't like, a regular pattern or anything.
I went to the store to purchase some apples. Is that metrical?
Okay,
Yes.
actually,
I went to the store to purchase some apples.
Wait a minute. I went to the store to purchase some apple. That's not metrical. I mean, it's not metrical, is it?
Well,
It is not. How about I went to the store to purchase some apples? That doesn't work.
nobody talks
I went to the store to purchase some apples. What is the difference between rhythm and meter?
Rhythm subdivides meter.
What?
Rhythm subdivides meter.
I wouldn't say that.
Meter is just something that we kind of impose on music to
Mm,
describe the rhythm, whereas rhythm is like something that's already there.
Well, that is that's the first step.
Right.
Right. That is a difference.
Any
But what
kind
basically is meter? What's the word for meter?
of, like to measure?
What?
To measure something?
Yes. And when you look at a ruler, right? What do you see?
A meter.
A
Bunch of
uneven
lines. You
lines
see
wherever you feel like.
Yeah. A bunch of lines. What?
Uneven lines spaced randomly.
You do? Yeah, maybe at the quantum level you might see that. Actually, you wouldn't see that at the quantum level, but maybe with a
See much.
closer inspection. That brings up another topic, the idea of generalization, but that's another topic for a different time. What's the one word that meter represents? What that you could use to describe meter? And it's the difference between rhythm and meter.
Regularity.
Okay. What's another word? Begins with an I.
Intrinsic. Iterative.
Iteration. Right? Meter is iteration. It's iterative. Some people think that is recursive. I think that's stretching it. I don't think that's totally accurate. Rhythm is not. It's the interplay of strong and weak stresses. Right? This is demonstrating in a very abstract or fundamental way the function of strong and weak stresses. The weak stress is a rhythmic effect. In this particular instance, it could be conceived of as a metric relationship. Why? Because we have arbitrarily divided this note, well, all these notes, into two parts to abstractly represent strong, weak, strong. That's only a representation. But now we're going to find out other things that go on in this when we extend that principle between the relationships of the voices. Now, go back to the second part of your question, right? If this is polyphonic, or we have these voices happening, right? This is really supposed to move to here, yes? In essence, this note, if we see the context of this note to this note, what is actually is it doing?
Along the dissonance.
It's preventing this from moving ahead, right? So in that sense, this is a delay. Yes? All right. But this is a leap. Both of these tones are dissonant. By definition, the dissonance connects by step the conditioning environment, right? It's the relational property that says this is going to that. And the most succinct and clearest way that it does that is by the stepwise motion. Right. However, on another level, if you're considering this voice moving in this dimension, this is an interval which has to be consonant because it is not stepwise. I mean, if you had a passing tone in here, which you can't, it would have to be, connecting the two consonances. Any leap away from a dissonant tone has got to have some kind of explanation constantly. It can't interfere with the motion of this moving, right? So therefore, this leap of a third, in essence, is acting in this level at the bottom as a delay. It keeps the voice from moving ahead. Now, that immediately shatters the idea that each one of these notes is a kind of independent entity, just moving along in some kind of undefined or unmotivated melodic concept. It's like the car driving to work. You following that? Okay. Now, if we don't construct our theory in stepwise piece like this, and it doesn't make sense, then there's no hope of being able to test it empirically over a wide variety of phenomena, which is the next step in the scientific process. You construct a theory and how you think about the theory. Did any of you watch that Richard Feynman example on YouTube where he's talking about understanding and knowledge? It's great. It's like Frank Sinatra giving a lecture. He was a dynamic teacher, really dynamic teacher, but he never talked about, cars driving to work or any other nonsensical idea like that. But he was definitely engaging, right? Okay. Well, at any rate, your philosophy about the theory has got to be sound enough so that whatever theory it is going to be able to, in the simplest and the most economical and impervious way, represent the phenomenon. Right? So far, we're on track. Are you following me or are you getting bored? Okay. Maybe this is, preaching to the converted. I don't know. Okay. Well, all right. Here we go. Now, we have some kind of logical disposition of this canis firmus. And we notice then that these things, these two tones, actually create some kind of a larger unit here, right? So it's this together, this in between, and that together, okay? Now, let's look at the top voice. Why all of a sudden are these things running in half notes? Because we're trying to generate a relationship that's moving faster to introduce an in-between note in the longest notes. So the concept of dissonance has moved to a new level, right? Now, this is where we have to introduce the ideas, a very complicated idea of necessity and contingency. What is the difference between necessity and contingency?
Must do versus having a backup plan if all else fails.
Well, that's the kind of folk science way of expressing it, but it's not the scientific view.
Is it equivalent to the scientific view?
No, it isn't. What is something that is necessary?
Food.
In a scientific sense, in a theoretical sense.
Sustenance.
Necessity is something that,
Something that cannot be done without.
yes, right, it must be, right? And a contingency is what? Something that
Can only be if.
could be otherwise. Yes? Isn't that the definition?
I thought it was what it said. Like something that can only happen if,
Like
something
it's
else.
contingent upon something else happening.
If the conditions are right.
Yeah, it could be otherwise, though,
If the conditions are not right.
if the conditions are not right. Yes. So, necessity is something that's a given. Contingency is something that could be otherwise. So, in the contingency aspect, how does this relate to this? Have any idea? So are you telling me that something that's contingent depends on something else that's necessary?
Not necessarily.
No, not necessarily. That's the correct answer. All right. But how would the principles of necessity and contingency relate here?
Having a dissonance would be contingent on it coming from a consonance and going to another consonance.
Right. In what context? Okay, now that's where we want to look at something. Look, if we take this line by itself, right? Okay? And we consider it in the same way that we considered this, as each note moving along. The first thing that you run into is the fact that that is a dissonance, yes? Well, what is it doing, occurring in this cantus firmus when you're supposed to, these are all supposed to be the relationships here that you're defining by these vertical frames are supposed to be consonant. In the individual line, that is an in-between tone, yes? Actually, where is that tone coming from? If this is going up like that, then this has to come from beneath this, right? La, si, do, right? Why is this as an in-between tone on something that is considered now metrically strong? Because this dissonant tone, sounding with that dissonant tone, produces a consonant interval. So the principles of consonance and dissonance in the vertical dimension now are functioning at a different rhythmic level than the cantus firmus. So the placing of this tone here is, and the motion to there, is dependent upon its consonant and dissonant relationship to that tone. But its relationship in the vertical dimension depends on the fact that this is going to the right place and that is somehow going to the right place eventually in the vertical dimension. So the dissonance in the vertical sense has moved to a different level. You see it operating on a different level. Now this is something that is definitely not promoted in the general theory of counterpoint. What happens to the relationships vertically in the first few bars of this? Is there some higher structuring principle going on here? Or are these all like separate bars? We've already said in the cantus firmus that this tone is actually dependent on that. This is dependent upon that. So automatically, this has grouped the cantus firmus into a 4-frame unit. Is that borne out by the top voice? I believe it is, yeah. But this is 2 bars. Is there any particular relationship that we can say that connects these 2 bars? If this is consonant, dissonant, consonant?
The third, is that what you're talking about?
Are these 2 bars connected?
Yes.
Yes, I would say that they're definitely connected, right? So what if we were to combine all of these consonant downbeat notes? What would you get?
A 6-3.
Yeah, a consonant sonority, a 6-3. This is a polyphonic unfolding of that chord. What's the function of that note then? It's a dissonance, right? Has nothing to do with that. This is the passing tone dissonance. And what would this be? What do we call that?
Skipped passing.
A skipped passing tone. But it must be consonant with one of these notes. It is, isn't it? What is the larger relationship of that note to this note?
B to A to G.
Yeah?
It's fine.
Did you say that?
Not quite like that.
What did you say?
I said
That was a passing.
B to A to G.
Okay.
I mean, it is a
All
passing
right,
note
yeah.
too, but like.
All right, well, that's a 6-5. Yeah? That's an undeniable thing, I think. So, the larger rhythm, right, is moved to a different level, although it's given out by the bass line. That's another important fact. So this is strong, weak, strong. Even though this occupies 2 frames, right? Okay? Now, if you're wondering about what are goals in a musical structure, how do you know where something is coming from and where it's going to? This is the answer to that, because this creates the prosodic structure. And that is actually dependent upon the relationship of the lowest sounding tone and the highest sounding tone. You see, as an artifactual thing, that there is a chord that's created in here, a vertical sonority. It happens to be a 6/3 moving to some kind of 5/3. That has absolutely no significance other than the fact that it's a passing sonority, polyphonically generated, that's connecting the unfolding of this chord. Now, no sooner have you done that and you've reached this point, you see something else happening. Is there any perceived relationship between this bar, this, and this?
Yes.
And what would that be?
I cannot answer that.
You cannot?
It's like
Okay.
all the same thing, right? It's all consonants.
This is all consonant?
No?
Well, by definition, the vertical bars have to be consonant. Is there a dissonance in here? Is there a larger connection? You're not looking.
Yeah.
Sol, fa, mi on top.
That's connected to what? You have mi and sol, and then you have what?
Voice
You don't have
exchange.
anything. Yes! Absolutely. Right? The octave change, we've already talked about that. It's the same note in a different register. Nothing's happening. Every time you have an octave change, it in no way changes the contrapuntal nature of the tone. So this is acting as a what? The octave change is acting really as a what?
Delay.
A delay, right? And this also gives you the idea that if you have a melody that goes dun 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 bum 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 bum, right? Those repeated notes, dun 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 dun. Do they mean anything?
Maybe.
No, they do not. They originate in meter or in iteration. Had nothing to do with the rhythmic motion. Didn't I hear yesterday this? Right?
Is that Bernstein's expansion of it?
It could be, yeah. Right? Okay. So those events, those kind of iterative events, or repetitions of single tones, do not factor into the voice leading. So we begin to say or see that the metric organization that you see in music is another level of organizing the material. Counterpoint in itself is incapable of structuring coherent. Well, no. It's easier to hear when you've got the metrical idea that participates in the unfolding of the tonality or the single sound that you're expressing. So that's not part of the, I don't think it's probably part of the abstract property of music itself. It's part of the phonotactic system, or one of the systems of the interfaces. Many people have a really hard time with that because they insist that African music is essentially based in banging on a can or a drum, which I violently oppose. Not to banging on a drum, but the fact that the origin of lot of African music is rhythmic or metric. Okay, are you with us? And I see you're fading into oblivion. All right, so explain to me the connection here. Is that a consonant bar? Yeah. And so it turns out, looks like to me, that this is another 6-3, is it not? Essentially, yes. Okay. So this sound is sustained across the bar. Then if we project this over, this becomes like another 6-5 thing. Yeah? Okay. This bar is what? You already said it. That's a passing tone, yes? Right? So all these passing tones on strong beats, dissonances on strong beats, hence your explanation of the appoggiatura effect, right? Okay, it's only on the surface. So have I answered all your questions so far?
Well, I have one, but I'll ask you after.
Okay, well, don't ask anymore. Okay, no, I'm teasing. Okay. All right, so that's a passing tone. And what is that?
Delay.
That is like a delay, yes. Okay? Now, does that add up to some kind of consonant sound? Yes. So this is a 6-3 inside of a 6-3, yeah? Okay? And this is a passing tone, right? Connecting that interval. And this is fulfilling, the prophecy of second species. Thou shalt have passing tones, right? Okay? All right, that's my engagement statement for the day. Okay? All right, and over here, that's not really a passing tone, but it is in the context of that, but this is another 6-5 thing, right? So, in my humble opinion, this is from here to here, consonant, dissonance, consonant, right? Dissonance, I'm drawing this to a close, and consonants, that is what?
Dissonant.
This would be part of that, right? Okay, well, how do you explain that?
The A.
Yeah, how do you explain the A? Then how do you explain this?
Oh, okay, 2 distances in a row. But the one on the D is transformed, right? It's consonant.
Yes.
Can we just?
This is consonant passing consonant. This is consonants. Ooh.
Well, is the
Yeah,
A
but
in like
it
a
might
higher
just-
frame or something than the transformed consonants over the D? Because it's within the bar.
All right. So it looks like on one hand we've hit a glitch. On the other hand, well, and if it's a glitch and it doesn't work, we have to throw the whole theory out. If, on the other hand, there's a deeper explanation for this, well, then maybe our theory might hold.
Maybe the G to A is a 5 to 6. And then you have a passing from the 6.
Yes, but where does the 5 to 6 actually come from?
The G and the A.
The B and the E.
Where's the-
What? Where's the B?
Oh.
You've lost me, Doc.
Really? How could I lose you?
It's only a 5 to 6 in context of do.
Yes. And isn't this a do chord that we've been expanding? Isn't it
Yeah.
there? Okay. So, in essence, somehow this note is there.
Yeah, it's right there on the bottom. C.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Right? Okay. Now, how do you get, well, this shows you how you get that, right? It's coming out of that note. Yes, that's the passing tone. This is coming up from below. Okay? Now, why does it make this descent so that it approaches the tonic from below, or the fundamental from below? So you get this much talked about required consonants, the sixth leading to an octave. Why is this? Why are the lines constructed that way?
Because contrary motion is better than parallel fifths and octaves.
Well, it's better than parallel octaves. And what is meant by that statement?
Don't follow the leading tone. When
If you go back to here, right, and we understand this as being like a part of a do major chord where that is the top tone. We've got sol, fa, mi, that is projected over. Mi, re, do, that should be there, right? And then if this is projected mi, re, do, the two voices collide in the same interval progression, right? And they end in the same way from above as the cantus firmus. Well, to avoid that, you must go underneath this and approach it from below. Right? Schenker calls that motion into the inner voice, and then he doesn't really explain the origin or the reason for that. He just assumes that you logically understand that if you construct this like in the normal way, where it descends to the tonic, you're going to have parallel motion. So the strategy is to try to construct opposing motion. So you have two different things, a more advanced level going on here, and that's where that comes from. Now, if you contemplate the second species in this context, you have a fairly good point of departure for understanding what happens in music. And I maintain what is an essential part of whatever parsing system that you have in your brain that recognizes logical musical structure. Now, music is a little different from language. Neither one of those systems are learned. They are acquired, because I am convinced that the brain is predisposed to acquire language and to acquire musical structures in the same way. The differences that you see in languages and in musicalistic systems are purely superficial, and that's the sound element. If you concentrate your energies on trying to figure out a theory of music or of language with just the relationship between the sounds, you are not discovering what is underneath that and what is actually motivating the infinite variety that you see in both language and music. Not only within a language, which is infinite in its ability to generate structures, but also across languages and across naturalistic music systems, not those that are created like the New York Times crossword puzzle. Those are puzzles, intellectual puzzles. But the ironic thing about that is that intellectual endeavor is predicated on the ability to have some kind of a rational thought. But once again, that's a different system that yields a different effect. Musical language is not problem solving. It's very different. And it's been demonstrated over and over again that if you make up a language where you have some kind of syntactical relationship or grammatical relationship between the words, the areas in the brain that process language syntactically, that comes in Broca's area and Wernicke's area, registers like it's a language. But if you take a sentence and just arbitrarily arrange the words, those areas don't light up. Light up, meaning, they don't show responses. So there's a significant difference between a random-based sequence of tones that embody some kind of syntactical and grammatical relationships that can be assessed hierarchically and or recursively, probably both, and those whose units or constituents are randomly put together in just a sequence, a counting sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's not considered to be language-based. Okay, all right. Well, there you go. That's the first part, which is incredibly long. Yes, question?
Finish your thing at the bottom, it's dissonance constants, right?
No, I just like to consider that.
If Peter the composer laid down his pen.
Yes. Okay. Will you accept that?
Great.
Okay, A plus. All right, I'll give you 100. What if you wrote a counterpoint like example like that? That's improvised. But what if you did that in your counterpoint class?
They'd probably accept it.
That what? Yeah, they would say, "Oh yeah, that's pretty good."
Show parallelism.
I think you need a little improvement, but you know, I wouldn't accept that. But you know, okay, all right. You know, I was in CBS the other day, and this is another one of my engagement speeches. I was in CVS the other day picking up some life-prolonging prescriptions, and people didn't have them filled according to my time schedule. So I blew up at them, and then they said, "Oh yeah, I'll have it ready in like exactly 7 minutes." I said, "Okay, you better or not." So I went over there and looked at the magazine section, which in CVS has been like relegated to now the size of about that, right? So they have 1 or 2 magazines, but they do have, and this isn't a plus actually, Scientific American. And I always like to look at that. Back in the good old days, Scientific American was a huge magazine, and it was filled with like really interesting things, you know? And I'd been reading Scientific American since I was like 3 years old. And it was a great magazine. I learned virtually everything I know from Scientific American. No, I didn't. Well, at any rate, and that's a good comment, because I go over there and I pick up the magazine, it's like 6 pages. Not really, like 10 pages. And I was thumbing through it and I thought, this is science? And then I came upon the clinker. This big article. What is truth? It's a huge question. It's like Socrates had written an article or something. And it goes on to say, the little subtitle, our notions of truth are changing. And they use the current political situation to give support for the idea that, well, you know, truth is not really what it's all chalked up to be. This in a scientific magazine. Well, you know, it almost says truth is opinion. And that it's making the statement, well, maybe truth is your truth and my truth. Right? That in a scientific magazine. Well, they tell you something about the current nature of science, does it not? On the one hand, it says science is no longer rationalistic inquiry, or at least that's been put on the back burner. That is far more likely that science can get further along by what? Statistical evaluation. Well, this says that. Well, that says that. Well, the truth is somewhere in between, right? Science, in the traditional mode, does not work that way.
Aren't a lot of academic studies, and especially biological studies, though, based on experiments that you can only gather empirical data from? Like, for instance, the work my parents are doing.
I don't know what your parents are doing.
Oh, it's right. I should probably substantiate. It's research on the way fat cells die and different
Rat cells die?
fat cells.
Fat cells die.
And looking at how different protein expressions can control that.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, after
What
a while,
is actually known about the generation of protein?
generation of protein?
Mm-hmm.
It's a
And the function of proteins, not only, the function of protein synthesis.
It's done.
Do we know how that's actually done?
Yes.
Do we know what the function of all those things are?
No.
No.
So some of it's from empirical observation and guesswork. You know,
Yeah.
very, 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 very solid guesswork, but
Well, I don't know how solid guesswork would be.
Well, I mean, let's look at the way DNA is wrapped. We know it's wrapped. We know it has something to do, well, probably something to do with protein expression, and we know we can manipulate that. We have no clue how to do it. That's empirical.
Well, there have been advances in that.
There's been CRISPR, there's gene editing, but that doesn't necessarily tell you about the folding of DNA now.
Well, that means that probably there's an aspect to genetics, or that general idea, that is stochastic.
Can you define stochastic in a sentence?
Well, this is what we've been talking about all morning long. The difference between necessity and contingency. Isn't usually a biological system explored in terms of its stochastic properties? A stochastic system, or a dynamical system, right? In a stochastic system, generally there are basic generative principles that apply, but the generative principle is sustained throughout the system that you're exploring, yet the generative principle in one level is pretty much autonomous in that level, and that the next level, although it may be using the same generative principle, is very, and as you go along, it's very hard to actually reduce it to the basic principle. And so statistical observations have to obtain. And so isn't an atomic system like that? Isn't the explanation of quantum features, or the structure of the atom, or notions of the properties of matter, isn't that eventually, doesn't it boil down to some kind of stochastic process?
I'm still unsure on the complete meaning of stochastic and how it's used, so I'm going to hold off on that answer.
Well, look at what stochastic is.
I did
And what does it say?
something random something.
Not able to be predicted randomly.
On that level, yeah. Not being able to be totally predicted when you look at the surface, right?
Okay.
However, stochastic systems do have a kind of generative substrate. That's the whole idea behind dynamical systems. The word Mandelbrot comes to mind, right? A Mandelbrot system, in a certain sense, can be considered stochastic. On another level, it can be considered purely deterministic. Why?
Because you can generate it with a function.
Yeah, the same function, right? But it yields results that when you look at it, there's no way that you can immediately see that that has been generated by the same function recursively enumerated. It's a very complicated thing. So in something that's considered stochastic, or something that is considered statistical, will it always remain that way? Would it always have the potential of remaining that way?
That referring to what?
In other words, if you have a system that on the surface seems completely random, and there are some components of it that seem completely deterministic, does that mean that the randomness that you see is really random? Or are there a whole bunch of missing steps or sequences?
Just you haven't figured it out.
What?
You just haven't figured it out.
You haven't figured it out.
So that's
And
where
it may
empirical
be
observation-
unknown. What?
That's where empirical observation.
Well, that's one aspect. And that's equivalent basically, you have to admit it, to intuition. And the observations that come out of those empirical observatory experiments, or whatever, it's not an empirical experiment, but the empiricist observations can lead to the development of abstract notions about structure that can then be used to formulate a theory, that can then be tested, maybe, for some process.
Would you say it's intuitive though? I mean, if, for instance,
Yes,
if
the
we
first step is intuitive.
look to make
yes.
an observation or to gather those observations into some
Well,
sort
the
of
gathering of
trajectory?
the data is empiricist, but it can yield certain things that if you look at it in the correct way, right, it could lead you to the formulation of some rational hypothesis.
It can't always be the product of intuition, though. If we look at Bayes' theorem, for example, if we look at some sort of test that tells you whether or not you have a disease, and it's 99%, chance of giving you positive, positive result for one, positive result. If it says you're positive, there's a 99% chance that it's true. If it's negative, there's a 95% it's true. The probability of having a false positive is astronomical.
Well,
That's not
yeah.
intuitive.
Yeah, well, but on the basis of that, however,
The whole
it could be
statistic.
wrong.
Yeah.
But, no?
What do you mean? What could be wrong then?
Well, I mean, that's not exactly the same as looking at a data set and saying that you understand what's going on, or that you understand how a system is operating. It can be used to predict a certain outcome, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you have learned anything about the process that has generated the data in the first place. That's all I'm saying, right? But those observations can lead you in certain circumstances to an idea that can produce that's where the philosophy of your theory comes in, that can be tested in some manner. Maybe it won't be able to be tested for a long time, but maybe it could in some abstract way. Is that not logical?
That makes sense, yeah.
Okay. Only in that. That's all I'm saying. Okay. All right. So, what is truth?
In a propositional statement, you can have a result that yields true or false. And if it's true, then all the propositions have been fulfilled exactly the way the statement, what's the word? The way the statement ordains. If it's false, then you haven't fulfilled one of the criteria.
Is that the scientific process?
In a sense.
Is that truth? Is that the definition of truth?
Definition, no.
What is
But it's equivalent.
natural law? Steven Weinberg gives an incredible lecture. He flies off the handle. Looks like he's about to explode. You know who Steven Weinberg is, right? Nobel laureate in physics. And actually, Murray Gell-Mann has basically says the same thing. I think he copied Weinberg's lecture. Not really. What is natural law? Are there principles that we have been able to observe or test that exist in nature that are unchangeable, that are fixed?
In what sense?
In that sense, observable phenomena that we have explanations for that don't change, and that have held across whatever we know about the universe. And that through mathematics, even though we don't know or visibly predict, but through the trust we place in mathematics, can assume that these things won't change at different levels.
Yes.
Have to extend it. Yeah, yes. So, a natural law, those laws don't change, as far as we know. But we don't know everything. But as far as mathematics can extend certain of those principles, and that I'm talking specifically about subatomic relationships, because there's no way of testing those, because the means to do that requires exploration at unimaginable, unfathomable small distances. But the mathematical formulation can lead to assessments that show that these laws are immutable. They don't change. They may appear in different forms, but they don't change. So in that context, truth has an absolute value. Is truth rooted in belief? No, it is not. Right. You may believe that 2 + 1 is 3. You may believe that, right? But it's also true. Yeah? That's actually my brain working. Okay. All right. Well, so much for that. Now, let's go to Siddhartha. How many of you have read Siddhartha? This is the moment you have all not been waiting for. Okay? All right. I beg you, urge you to read it. I would like to be able to discuss the first part of this, and now it's time for me to sit down. Siddhartha is one of my favorite little books, and it basically establishes through a beautiful story the philosophical premise of what I try to do in here. And so I would like for you to read it and ponder it deeply, because it has amazing information in it, and it's a beautiful story. I talked in the last class about the concept of rasa, and rasa is a attribute of Krishna, and Krishna is like the supreme, right? Beyond the Atman. And it actually is it's sometimes translated as bliss. Well, I don't know what bliss is. Well, I do, but in the sense here, it means an all-encompassing peace. And sometimes it's translated as all-encompassing knowledge. Well, somehow that's a little bit different. But the kind of knowledge that the Upanishads are referring to is not kind of 1 + 1 is 2 knowledge, although it could. So the book is essentially about what is the nature of that all-encompassing peace. And it's Siddhartha, which is another name given sometimes to Gautama Buddha. The word Siddhartha is 2 Sanskrit words put together. It means one who has achieved his goal, or her goal. Right? And so Siddhartha is a young man who, I guess, lives in Nepal or whatever, and he goes on a spiritual quest. He is filled with the flame of discontent, which is a primary flame necessary for any kind of creative experience or creative life, I think. And what is the flame of discontent? What is discontent?
Desire for that which you do not have.
Could be, yeah. There's an aspect of that in it. Does it mean that you're trying to acquire something? Or is it that you just know that there is more than what you are experiencing?
The latter.
The latter, probably, yeah. Okay, but it's still related in some sense to desire. But it's not the desire to have a 40-room mansion with
I think
a
it's,
bowling alley in each room.
I think it maybe is a little bit different from desire because you don't know as specifically what it is that you want or are looking for. At least that was what it was like in
Yes, I think so. I believe it is true. All right. So before I start reading long passages from the book, right, and there are many that I would like to discuss, what is your take on this? What happens in the first part of this? Basically, about three things, right? Siddhartha decides to leave home, and his close friend, Govinda, decides to go with him on this journey. So that's number one. And there's a big deal about Siddhartha's leaving home. Yeah? How did that unfold?
He wanted to, so he stood still and patiently till he got his way.
What did his father say?
Well, first he said no, but then seeing that Siddhartha wasn't going to move, seeing how convinced Siddhartha was that this path was the best for him, he accepted that his son is right and let him go.
Yes, he let go, right? One of the reasons why this unfolds like this at the beginning seems like a trivial fact, like a parent not wanting a child to do something. But there's a specific reason why I think this was made into such a big deal here. And what?
Because of what happens later with.
Yes, absolutely. It's the whole background of this. So the parent lets go completely of the son. And he says, if you find this enlightenment or whatever it is that you're looking for, if you find it, you can come back and tell us all about it, right? But essentially, he has let go of his upbringing, his parents, in search of something else, right, that he doesn't know. All right, the next step is what? Govinda and Siddhartha leave, and they first encounter what?
The Samanas.
Samanas, yes. Who are they?
Crazy people.
They're the Hare Krishna people that run around in Grand Central Station in New York, right?
They
Issuing the mantric rhythm. You never heard that in New York? And they wear yellow robes, right? Now, right now, who are the samosas, or not samosas, but samanas? Who are they? And what do they believe? And why? And how long do Govinda and Siddhartha stay with them?
2 or 3 years.
Years.
I think so, yeah. 'Cause it's,
Yeah.
How long?
A couple of years
Yeah.
at least.
3 years, no?
It says 3
Yeah.
years. Did you say 3 years? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, 3 years. Oh my gosh, what a long time to like sit on a rock and like contemplate the mysteries of existence. It's beyond that. What are this? What was the philosophy of the Samanas?
Asceticism?
What did you say?
Asceticism?
And what is asceticism?
Like you have to completely like get rid of your senses and like get rid of the notion that like we should be comfortable or healthy or anything to like overcome the self.
To overcome the self.
Desire is poison.
Yeah.
Those kind of desires.
Any desire in there, but
I know. Maybe crunch.
All right, look at page 6. The Samanas once passed through Siddhartha's town, wandering ascetics. They were three thin, worn-out men, neither old nor young, with dusty and bleeding shoulders, practically naked, scorched by the sun, solitary, strange, and hostile, lean jackals in the world of men. Around them hovered an atmosphere of still passion, of devastating service, of unpitying self-denial. Well, if that's not a definition of asceticism, I don't know what is. Right? I don't know what that means. What is an atmosphere of still passion. What is passion?
Suffering for someone else. That's what it means.
Is that what it really means?
That's yours. That's yours. That's
Isn't that
Suffer.
Does anybody have a copy of my book here with you?
I thought that
It's a
talked
good
to
point.
it.
Nobody has a copy of that
Just
book?
maybe you are.
It begins with a quotation from Kierkegaard. And it says that ours is an age devoid of passion that flies into enthusiasm at 1 minute, then recoils into indolence in another. Plus, passion, what's another word for passion?
Fervor.
A more fancy word. He's very passionate about his Play-Doh. Except for me at age 6 months. What's another word for passion? Begins with an E. It has a Greek root.
Endure? Enthusiasm?
Enthusiasm.
Oh,
Really?
What does the word, yes, what does the word enthusiasm mean?
like you're all excited about it.
No.
I
What's
think
the root of the word
Is
enthusiasm?
much more narrow than passion, though, because passion is a wide variety of different kinds of strong emotions, and enthusiasm is a much narrower subset of that I don't think is the correct description of the samanas.
Yeah, and
Well,
enthusiasm-
what if we were to understand the etymological root of
Well,
enthusiasm?
you want to talk about etymological root, the word here is Leidenschaft, which has nothing to do with enthusiasm.
And what about
I'm not sure that it does.
Wait, where does the word enthusiasm come from? Okay, what is it?
Tell us.
I'm looking it up right now.
That's how cavalier language is, anyway. Suffering is only one aspect of
It's
passion.
interesting because Leidenschaft, Leiden, it comes from suffering.
Exactly.
So
Not enthusiasm. It's a much more despairing, painful side of passion than being passionate about Plato.
But I'm saying that that is also an instance of no matter what language you're in, the words have taken on a different meaning.
Well, that's the thing, like the meaning of a word can change over time, but I have that enthusiasm just means like a strong feeling.
No, no, no. That
Like,
has nothing to
positive
do
word
with the etymological root of that word.
Yeah.
The passion of Christ.
Theos.
Leiden is the word that's generally used for that in German, yes. Okay? In that kind of passion. What?
Yes, it comes from Greek theos, God.
God. So what does enthusiasm mean? The state of being God. Fill in the blank.
impassioned, possessed,
One with.
surrounded?
Filled. Right. It means filled with God spirit or God notion. That directly relates to the concept of passion. Right? And the narrow meaning of the word passion, or Leidenschaft, or whatever it is the suffering of Christ. Christ was what?
Jewish?
Well, it was that, I guess. I don't know. That's inconsequential. Christ was what?
Divine and human.
It was God
Yeah.
in the form of a human. All right. I mean, words mean something very, very specific if you go back to the root. Right? So passion in this sense relates to all of those things, right? But what is an atmosphere of still passion? How can passion be still if you're writhing in pain or suffering? Does that mean that you're stoic?
Yes.
It's internal.
I don't think that's what passion means in this sense, in the Vedic sense. I'm trying to communicate some different ideas.
Like whatever is going on, like their encounter with God or whatever, they're not showing it in like a physical way.
Well, maybe that passion or enthusiasm is related to, in a certain sense, rasa.
What is rasa again?
Bliss. Not the kind of stuff I use in my coffee. It's really great.
Is that a creamer or a sweetener?
It's both.
It's a dairy-based creamer that's very sweet.
It's both.
It's really great.
Wow, that is blissful.
I don't have to use sugar anymore. I can use that, but if you look at the label, it's like 90% sugar.
Ah!
Ingredients.
Fantastic. Okay, let's go. All right, come on. Atmosphere of still passion, of devastating service. What in the world is devastating service?
Service that devastates oneself.
Well, we're not exactly serving humanity by doing that.
No,
No, certainly not.
they're not
devastating
going out of
humanity
their
either.
way to like help the poor, right? Or are they?
They are the poor. They're trying to help.
The
themselves.
devastating service is what?
Self-devastating.
I would say so. Yeah. The service to the destruction of the internal concept of the self. But of course, no one ever mentions the fact that they must have an idea of what the self is in order to be devastatingly devoted to eradicating the self. Right? By the way, what is the root of the word Veda? Anybody know? You'll only hear this in here. I think I can get this right. That's the Sanskrit root, right? And there is a Greek cognate, if I can remember it.
Sacred knowledge.
The most ancient hymn
Forgotten the last
scriptures.
letter. Oh,
Early Sanskrit containing hymns, philosophy, and guidance on ritual for the priests of the Vedic religion.
that is the Greek cognate of this Sanskrit root. And what did you say that id is? The Latin cognate would be videre, which means to see. Right? Vid, right? And this is what? You know, remember the Greek letters?
I wish.
Eidos.
E-I-D-O-S. Eidos, which is closely related to what word?
Idiot.
Idea.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Idea is something that's seen in the mind. Yeah.
Huh.
So the Vedic knowledge, or the Vedas, of which there are 4 basic ones. Some authorities think there are 5. There are 4, and they're divided into several subcategories. One of which is the Upanishad, which is like the commentary on the Vedas. But they're essentially ideas about the nature of the world. It's a cosmological view, philosophical view. All right. So the devastating service is an effort to, they're devoted to getting rid of the self, notions of the self, ideas of the self. But there's a trap in that, obviously. All right? Of unpitying self-denial that goes along with devastating service. What is unpitying self-denial?
Without remorse, without second thought.
Yeah, I mean, it's,
without
you know,
sympathy for
not,
yourself.
oh, poor me, I have to give up all of this in order to get that. Right. Okay, all right. Well, now let's set the stage for those folks. All right. And then the next chapter is with the samanas, okay? All right, here we go. The first section, page 11, top of the page. Siddhartha had one single goal, to become empty of thirst, desire, dreams, pleasure, and sorrow, to let the capital self die. No longer to be capital self, to experience the peace of an emptied heart, to experience pure thought. That was his goal. When all the self was conquered and dead, when all passions and desires were silent, then the last must awaken, the innermost of being, that is no longer self, the great secret.
Doesn't this paragraph have a contradiction? Yeah, unbeknownst to Siddhartha? How do you pronounce it? He had a goal, which is to rid himself of the goals. Sort of self-defeating.
Absolutely. Right? I think this is a kind of ironical passage. And there you are. We're getting to the part with heart music in a minute, too. Right? Okay. Welcome. All right. So, is it a goal? That's what you just said. Is it a goal or a desire?
Both. Interchangeable.
In this case, the goal is like a desire, right? I mean, a material desire. Okay. All right. Let's look at the second another passage from page 13. Siddhartha said, "It does not appear so to me, my friend. What I have so far learned from the samanas, I could have learned much more quickly and easily if I'd taken Dr. Lawlerstadt's counterpoint class." No, quickly and, see, that's engagement. No, and easily in every inn in a prostitute's quarter, among the carriers and dice players.
What's it?
You got to get the stochastic stuff in there, or statistical analysis there, right? Govinda said, Siddhartha is joking. How could you have learned meditation, holding of the breath, and insensibility towards hunger and pain with those wretches? And Siddhartha said softly, as if speaking to himself, what is meditation? What is abandonment of the body? What is fasting? What is the holding of the breath? It is a flight from the self. It is a temporary escape from the torment of the self. It is a temporary palliative against the pain and folly of life. The driver of oxen makes the same flight, takes temporary drug when he drinks a few bowls of rice wine or coconut milk. Not quite the same thing. In the end, then he no longer feels his self, no longer feels the pain. So he's come to the rather radical conclusion that all of this process of self-abnegation is nothing more than reinforcing a concept of the self that's slightly different from the other one. Yes? All right. So what is the moral of this story?
They learned nothing.
Yeah. You're not really learning anything. You're just adopting another system. Yeah. All right.
Well, maybe the system works, but they came in with the wrong attitude.
Do you think
There's-
it's the system that works, or that the system just happens to be a means to the end?
Well,
Do
either
you think
way,
the system is the end?
Well, if the system is the end, that means what? How do you know what the end is?
I don't think you do. I mean,
Wait a minute. No. Well, how do you know what the end is? If you say the system is a means to the end, it means what?
The final banishment of the self.
Is what?
The end.
Death.
So that means you have decided what the end is going to be, yes? So you have knowledge of, you have constructed some notion of what the end is going to be.
Well, it's hard to get anywhere if you don't know where you're going, just like the car that has to drive through the Canis Furnace.
Yes, well, it's back basically on that level. You're right.
Regardless of whether this system is successful or not, they went to whatever doctrine with the wrong attitude, and so it's no surprise that they're still that Siddhartha is still skeptical about it.
Who says it's the wrong attitude?
Well,
Right,
I mean,
concept,
say that.
I want to win, and the whole point of it is like you don't want, period. And then Govinda's there's talking about these wretches and having feelings and passions and opinions about things when really you shouldn't have anything. So they haven't accepted the doctrine at all. They've practiced it and they've learned nothing and they've gone nowhere. So of course they're still skeptical about it, whether or not the system itself works.
Yes,
Well-
but go ahead.
Okay, I was just gonna say, like, this is gonna sound very kind of shallow and relativistic, but like, this is also only Siddhartha's opinion
Yeah.
of all those people, and maybe it's like his spiritual quest, and like it's not the place that he receives enlightenment or whatever, but like, and I guess this like also kind of connects to another point later on in the book that like, it's not like your true enlightenment unless like you discover it for yourself. But where was I going?
But in
Like
order,
obviously, like some ascetic at some point, like that was what worked for them, and like that was how they found whatever they were looking for.
Well, and he describes later on that all of these things shaped him.
Yeah,
The asceticism, the intense passion,
yeah,
all of those things, none of them were what he was looking for, but they were all something
Yeah.
that had to be there.
It's funny. There's
Well,
like a
I always-
progression.
I always give examples from my own, whatever it is, from the things that I've done in my life. And you all know that I spent a great deal of time working in a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center, right? And I have seen over and over again, and this is basically with teenagers, and I had really good training from about 3 or 4 different people. I could tell you one story where they like jumped all over me, and it was my compassion for someone that led me to an inappropriate decision. But I've seen it happen over and over again. The program of Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or whatever it is, it's a 12-step program, and people follow it, right? And I've forgotten exactly what the order of the steps is, but it's something, the steps that you take, it's recommended that you take in order to get rid of the problem. And so we might frame the condition of alcoholism or drug addiction or anything like that as a unstoppable desire. But then you get to the point of where they're, sitting in my group, and they're taking the steps, and they're talking about their situation, and they have a desire to not drink or do drugs anymore, and they go through this program, which back then was like a month or something like that, and then it was to be followed up with either going into another facility called a halfway house, and then continuing along the same pattern of repeating the program over and over again in the context of a meeting. Well, what do you think the success rate is in that kind of situation?
Low.
Close to 0. And it turns out that the desire following a program or something is people, I've seen teenagers, 15 years old, that are desperate to get out of that situation. And they are all convinced that they're on the right track, that if they just do this, and if they follow the steps, and if they do everything they're going to say, that they'll be fine. Well, generally, the general pattern is that within 2 weeks, they're right back out there. So obviously, the correct attitude in that case and following the pattern or following the program has no effect. Why is that? Is it a defect in the program?
Well, if you finish the program successfully and then
But what does that mean?
if you follow all of the steps,
Mhm.
then you feel like you've accomplished it and then you're done. And then you feel you don't have to necessarily do anything more past that.
Well, yes, okay, but you do have to repeat that over and over again. You have to continually go to meetings or whatever it is. Now, look, I'm not knocking that program because that opens the door, and I've done my best to, guide people in that direction because it's I don't want to go deep. I don't want to say too much more.
Well, it's kind of like, even if you, like, say you get into Curtis and you're, like, really good and, like, you go to class and everything, you can still graduate from Curtis, like, without, like, having much of a knowledge of, like, musical studies. If you, like, don't want to be in class. So, like, there's nothing wrong with the program, the same way that there's nothing wrong with, like, the classes that we take at Curtis. But if you don't, like, have some sort of desire to, like, change, kind of parallel to, like, being here and, like, having some sort of desire to, like, learn or whatever.
Oh, okay. Well, no, wait a minute.
I might be totally on the wrong track.
This brings up
Sorry.
something that I have to mention right now.
Okay.
Can somebody look up the 12 steps in AA? Is that on the?
Yeah, there are a lot of diagrams.
And I'd like to look at, yes, Michael.
Oh, I was going to answer the previous question, I think. I mean, it seems like the 12 steps only addresses sort of what it is that you're doing, but it doesn't address, like, the reasons why you're doing that, and the reasons why you're doing that are, like, very individual, it seems. Like, it's not, like, it only, like, if you have a drug addiction or whatever, the 12 steps might be a way for you to stop doing that action, but the reason you might continue doing it is because whatever your individual problem was that caused you to do it is not being addressed on an individual level.
And so what is that point? That's very insightful. And what does it point to when you talk about individual? It means that it is what kind of a problem?
It's internal problem.
Yes,
So
it's internal problem.
the reason you're doing those things, it's sort of a physical manifestation of whatever your problem is. And it's like a way of you showing that. So if that is not attacked or addressed, then you're just going to keep
Exactly.
doing it.
But the internal problem, it means that it is what kind of problem?
individual.
Well, like a
Just the same thing.
Internal and intentional. What is that a process of? I've said it, yes! And so, what kind of thought? Not mechanical thought. That addresses the physical sensations. But what? Psychological.
That's really interesting because National Geographic ran an article that said like the opposite.
Yeah, well, of course,
Literally the opposite
that's
about
modern
4
day
months ago.
thinking.
Yeah.
That's your relativistic
Well, like,
thinking.
I trust them.
That I'm okay, you're okay. It's your truth, my truth. Somebody read the 12th step.
12 steps. Tell me if this is wrong. 1. We admitted we're powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable.
No, that's it. That's it. Just read the 12th step.
The 12th, like number 12.
Yes.
Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs.
Okay. Well, what do you think about that? Doesn't that connect with something that the Samanas have to say? Isn't that what they're trying to demonstrate? No? You don't see the connection? Now look, I am not denigrating the programs of NA or AA or BA or MA or whatever. I'm not doing that. Because I'm saying that, as you suggest, or other people suggest, it's an avenue of departure, like the car in the counterpoint exercise. It's an avenue of departure. And I'm not sure that Govinda is following this, but Siddhartha is recognizing that it is, while the information in it is true, and these people are living in X way, that it's not producing Y results for him. And that he understands that it's limited. There has to be something deeper than that. And that's precisely what you're talking about. That it does not address the actual problem. It's a way of addressing the problem, but no one is going to address that problem. No external method or system can get to the problem because it is internal. And there is no question about the fact that your brain and the processes of thought are internal and intentional to you. Your worldview is your worldview. But everybody's brain that creates a worldview is doing the same thing. Why are those views different?
As a result of genetics, experience, stochastic processes.
So, we might accumulate, we might look at the same, have the same sensory experience, yet the psychological aspect might put things together that somebody else's mind might not put together. The psychological accumulation in anybody's mind is a rigid structure. It's like an object. It's like a thing. And we attribute the same stability or the same actuality to that construction as we do to the piano, which is also a product of thought, and that has a relative independence from thought. But the psychological structure is viewed the same way, although, as all the Vedas and every other religion and religious system in the world tell you, it is illusory. But saying the fact, yes, it is illusory. Yes, this is a habit. I shouldn't do it. Yes, I should do this. Yes, I should do that. That has nothing to do with the rigidity of the structure itself. That is the content of this. But there are further ramifications. So this is where Siddhartha and Govinda are stumbling along here. And of course, because the book has like a contrapuntal character, it moves along, right? So Siddhartha has come to the conclusion that, no, I have questioned the holy Vedas. Perhaps Govinda would have been equally as good if I'd questioned the rhinoceros or the chimpanzee. I've spent a long time, and I've not yet finished in order to learn this, Govinda, that one can learn nothing. That you should underline 400 times. Well, you wouldn't have anything else on the page. I can learn nothing.
Oh, okay.
There is, so, in the essence of everything, something that we cannot call learning. There is, my friend, only a knowledge that is everywhere. This is part of the definition of rasa. It is a knowledge that's not the knowledge of learning. That is Atman. It's not even that. Krishna is above the Atman. That is in me and in you and in every creature. And that's grossly misinterpreted, I think. And I am beginning to believe that this knowledge has no worse enemy than the man of knowledge or of learning, than learning. Now, in my way of thinking, this has grave implications for the cooperative existence of human beings. And it extends from the very superficial down to the very, very monumental and important and significant. It also has, in my opinion, a direct relation to what music is. Music is a mysterious thing. It's obviously rooted in thought. But there are aspects of music, as there are in language, that are rooted in something deeper. Some people call it creativity, but no one has yet come up with a definition of creativity. All right, so I beg you, I earnestly implore you, to read this and read it carefully and to express your thoughts on this. I think that at least I feel like we've gotten somewhere today. And I just think it's just my feeling, there can be no more important thing than you can do. When you're 20, when you're 30, when you're 40, when you're 60, when you're 80. Do it sooner than later. Peace. I'll see you next week. Thank you so much. Continue reading.
So you went to grammar, right?
That's not that bad.